Hello, my class. Welcome to another episode of Storytime with Mrs. Edwards. And we are going to be carrying on reading SEO Trot today. So I've got some children here who are waving at you again at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to start where we left off. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. "Your slave for life," he kept repeating to himself. "What bliss!" But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect his carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them altogether. Some illustrations for you to look at. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in their colour of their shells. Alfie had a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more. But he didn't want any that weighed less. "Feed them cabbage leaves," the pet shop owners told him. "That's all they need, and a bowl of water." When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all, but it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes, some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from a big shallow dish. They made just the faintest rustling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet, but that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. Here's all his tortoises in his room. Hundreds and hundreds of them. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or two. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these he attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So on that first exciting afternoon, after he made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony, armed with his long metal pole. He called this his tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered the pole down onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the 2 claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed so tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. Yeah, there's his contraption. Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same colour shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much, it is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that they knew that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice. Wonder what he's going to do, what his plan is. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. When he had got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of his tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender, juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick, old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Pictures? Oh. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling!" she cried out. "Mummy's back! Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper. "S-E-O trot, teg regib regib. Emok no, S-E-O trot, warg poo, foop poo, tush poo, nerps poo, wob poo, loose poo, eggrog, elzug, futz, plug, tup no taff, S-E-O trot, tup no taff, teg no, elbog doof." Reading to a tortoise. Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, "Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Alfie tonight?" "Oh, he's lovely," Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. He's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words." "You never know," Mr. Hoppy said darkly. "You never know." Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weight 13 ounces. End of the first week, tortoise number 2, weight 15 ounces. End of the second week, tortoise number 3, weight 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4, 19 ounces. End of the fourth week, tortoise number 5, 21 ounces. End of the fifth week, tortoise number 6, 23 ounces. Okay, little chart. So slowly getting bigger and bigger. End of the 6th week, tortoise number 7, 25 ounces. And end of the 7th week, tortoise number 8, 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. Okay, we're going to have to stop there for today. Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Storytime with Mrs. Edwards. Remember that if you want to see the illustrations, I don't hold them up for very long, so just pause the video and you can have a look. All right? Have a wonderful day, everyone, and I'll see you... Oh, have a wonderful weekend, actually. It's Friday. Have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you all on Monday for another episode of Storytime with Mrs. Edwards, SEO Trot. Bye-bye!